Hi, my name is Wayne, and this is Type Tested. Today, I want to do something a little bit different. What I have is a Smith Corona Early Electric. This is a 5TE series, and I've got it stripped down so I can finish cleaning it up. Almost done with the process, still have a few more things to do, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to be able to go over the operation of this electric unit. I don't really see a whole lot of videos out on the net that show this sort of thing, so I thought that it would be worth helping people understand just exactly how these units operate mechanically and electrically, and help them to understand what it takes to maintain these and keep them operational. Many people look at an electric and they think, I know nothing about electricity, I know nothing about how this stuff operates, I don't want anything to do with it, and I'm not going to touch it. And they're afraid to even try. But the important thing to note about this particular series, and this is not like an IBM electric, which is a very different system. I'm talking like the 11B or C or the early IBMs, where they're almost purely electrical. This is an electromechanical device. So it uses electricity to accomplish certain of its functions, but the functions are all mechanical. And what really happens is the electrical systems provide a link between those mechanisms. So if I press a key, I am operating a cam. That cam is then tripped by an electric rotor, which then operates the type bar and drives it up against the platen. Now what this does is it means that the type bars are driven with the same amount of force every time, no matter how hard you press the keys or how quickly you let off it. As long as you press it enough to be able to allow the cam to trip, you get the impression you desire. And that makes for a much cleaner appearance. And one of the things that they can do is you can adjust things like the period, the comma, the apostrophe, the colon, and the dash to have a little bit less force so that they give the same sort of impression. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the things this spring back here is for. People don't realize this. If I shift the carriage down by hand, watch, you'll see the spring get trapped back behind this bracket, which effectively takes it out of play. So when it's up on the lower case, because it's a little bit because the position on the type bars, it can come up with a little more force, and the spring will stop it from impacting too terribly hard. But as you go to the uppercase, well, you need a little bit more force to get the same sort of matching impression. So the spring then is taken out of play by being pushed up against the type guide through this bracket here. So things like that Smith Corona did to try to get the best quality type in a fairly cheap and affordable unit as they could. And it worked pretty well. Now, one thing I've done with this, which I don't usually do, is this particular unit had ridges on the platen that were a little bit higher than they should have been. So I took the platen out, took the knob off, chucked it in the drill bit, chucked it in my electric drill, and just spent about a minute with a 600 grit sanding sponge, just lightly sanding off the tops of the ridges. Now you'll notice, if you look carefully here, that I didn't take everything off. All I wanted to do was flatten it out a bit so that they would be less of an issue. And that's fine as far as distance on the platen goes, because it's only about 1/1000th of an inch, if even that. So you can lose a couple thousandths and not affect the typing at all. So the first thing to do when you're looking at one of these typewriters is to make sure that everything is safe. And that on these is a lot simpler than a fully electric unit. Obviously, the first thing you want to do is you want to check over the power cord. You want to make sure it's not frayed. You want to make sure it's not cracked. This particular unit, you'll note, in keeping with the age, is a two-prong connection. So we have a neutral and we have a hot. So both connections carry current and there is no ground. That was not something that was commonly done except in high voltage, high capacity equipment, where it was a little bit more important that this be the case. In the home equipment, not so much. The other thing you'll notice here is that these are exactly the same size. And that often led to being able to flip around the connection and be able to put the neutral where the hot goes and the hot where the neutral goes. And that could, in some cases, lead to very dangerous situations. Because in some instance, what you would have is you would have the frame of the unit being used as the ground potential. So your neutral and your ground essentially be serving the same purpose. But if you got those connections backward, then the case became electrified instead of being at ground potential. That could possibly be unsafe. Now that's not the case here, and it can't really happen. There's nothing connecting any of the electrics to the frame of this case. It's all, or the frame of the typewriter, it's all completely isolated. You don't have to worry about that at all. But that's part of the reason why we have the keyed plugs. So one wider than the other. And if you look on any outlet, I get my extension cord up here, and you can see that we have one that is taller than the other in order to make sure that they can't be put in backwards. Then, in addition, having the ground connection means that, and that being required to be tied to the case of such a unit, makes it so that if there's any electrical fault, it immediately trips a circuit breaker or something, or a fuse in the unit, and protects the operator. So where you're most likely to find problems on the cable is going to be right here, right where the plug joins the cable, and back here where the plug joins the typewriter. So if you see any sort of cracking or fraying, then the power cord should probably be replaced. It's not difficult to do on most units, and it's something you shouldn't fear doing on your own if you have a little bit of sense, or calling a friend over and say, hey, could you know anything about electrical connections? Can you help me replace the power cord in this typewriter? It's not going to be a big deal. And if you want, you can just buy, your typical extension cord, two-prong extension cord, and sacrifice the cord to take the place of what was originally supplied with it. Color doesn't really matter. It's just part of the design, the color choice of the typewriter. This being gray, sometimes you'll see them white, sometimes you'll see them black, sometimes you'll see them brown. It doesn't really matter. So, first off, we go ahead and load up a piece of paper here and show you how everything is meant to operate. Now, you'll notice I don't have any ink spools in here, so this is just a simple demonstration. I put the paper in here just to make sure that I don't put too much punishment on the platen. So, plug the typewriter in, turn it on, and you'll notice that this here operates as a safety. So when you have the cover on, if you open up the cover, the typewriter automatically turns off. Now, some people, when they're working on, what they will do is they'll bend that down underneath this lip. I'm just going to hold it here because it doesn't really matter for me at this particular point. Okay, so if I type, you'll notice that no matter how lightly I press on the keys, I get a very firm impression on the other side. If I turn the impression control up from 1 to 9, and you listen, you can hear that it's much snappier, so there's a lot more force being used. Generally speaking, for your typing, keep it down at 1 or 2, just depending on what you're trying to do. I wouldn't go above 3, because again, that would just put too much punishment on the platen. So what this is for use with carbon copies. Some of these machines you can do up to 9 or 10 copies with a single pass, but you have to press very hard to get that to happen, and the further you go through the carbon, the more blurry they get. So most people don't recommend going more than 3 or 4 carbon copies, and you're not really going to have to worry about that anyway, because who does carbon copies anymore? Unless you specifically want to, for nostalgia's sake, you can still buy carbon copies. Anyway, so that is this. Now, I want to go to the side here and point out how this operates. So I still have the unit turned on, the safety switch is down. Now, the electrical connections, what their purpose is to drive this motor here which drives this pulley inside, which drives this pulley. This is a variable, which is operated by the touch control or the impression control. You can see it moving the spring here. What that does is it changes the position of this pulley a little bit and changes the tension on this belt. Now this, adding tension, increases the force that the type bars have applied to them when you press the connection. Now, an interesting thing here is if I turn the motor here, notice that I can turn this all day long and this is not moving because this is what is called a centrifugal clutch. If I press in these two little protrusions here, you can see that this arm is trying to come out. Now, what happens is that this is a very low torque motor. It can't have the load applied to it when it starts, or it may not start. So what happens is the electricity starts the motor, it gets it spinning, and then when it's spinning beyond a certain threshold, you will see the springs, you'll see the arms, the weight of the arms pull on springs and engage the clutch and then engage the belts. Now you can watch that here and you'll actually be able to hear this engage. So watch this and watch that. So spinning, engage, and notice that keeps spinning after those have stopped because the clutch has disengaged. It's actually a very nice system, but this is one of the things that has to be paid attention to when you're working. There needs to be a certain amount of play here, and the set screws here need to be firmly in place to make sure that there is no slip, because if it slips, it's going to grind down on the motor shaft and then you have real problems. Now these belts, they can often take a set, meaning that if you leave them in the same place for years, they'll tend to form to that position. Now this one doesn't show it that much. This one really will. So you can see it's not quite oval or round, and you can see that there's a little bit of a kink here where this was for the longest time wrapped around that pulley. I don't worry about that too much. Some people, they see that and they'll immediately want to replace the belt. The reason I don't worry about it too much is that this will tend to work itself out over time. Now, I will note that the tension on this belt is a little bit light, but it's okay because it's not really affecting anything once I get this belt in place. And remember, this is on a spring. It's supposed to be able to allow a certain amount of movement. If I start this up again, sometimes you'll see a lot of wobble in here, and that, or a lot of bouncing, and that is because of that set. So as it runs across here, it's changing the tension of the belt because it doesn't have the give it's supposed to. The best way to get that out is to just use your typewriter. Just have it out for a few weeks and use it every day. And that will, over time, tend to work itself out. Now this belt hasn't done that yet, and it will take a while to do it. And of course, if you tear it off and then leave it sit for years, you're going to pick up a different set. Again, it's okay. It's not that big a deal. One thing to watch for on these belts is see if there's any cracking on the underside or any cracking on the outside here, an indication that they will need to be replaced. All right, so that being said, I am going to remove this clutch and these belts because that will be necessary for me to go talk to you about how the motor is set up. So I'm going to take this off here, push that out of the way. And just as it has to be set in solidly, be careful to use the right screwdriver so that you don't cam out the screw heads and strip everything. So this shows how the clutch operates. There are the springs and here are the weights. It's just that simple. Let me set that aside. Here is the clutch bearing. What happens is this sits inside here, and then as this trips, these little arms here hit the nose on that bearing here and catch it so that it can start driving the belts. So this turns freely. This is set onto the motor shaft. This then turns the clutch bearing, which then turns the pulleys. Now there's a little bit of filter paper here. I've actually replaced this one. You can see the original right here versus the replacement I made. And I did that because this is very, very thin. And that provides a little bit of friction relief so that this doesn't wear out. So I'm going to take this off, and then I'm going to unplug the typewriter, which I actually should have done before. Switch it off, turn it up, and then I'm going to release the motor. That is done by taking these 4 screws out here. Just those 4, and it will fold forward. Okay, there. That. I don't think this one has to come all the way out. I'm not even sure it will. Take this out. That. And then we can work this, lift this up here, pull the motor shaft through the side gently. Tip it forward and pull it out here. Now, you can remove this. I don't really advise doing it because it's just not necessary. So, here is our motor and our transformer. These are the primary electrical connections. Now, these are just simple wire nuts / crimps. They're permanent, so don't try to undo them. But here's your main power connection. So here is where you need to check for damage. And as I said, along with this power cord is in really good shape. So what we have here are connections into the motor and another connection here going to the power switch. So you'll notice that one connection goes into the transformer, one connection goes out the transformer, over to the power switch, back in, and over to the neutral. And I'll get to that in just a minute. What I want to talk about here is this motor and its stator. So we have the rotor, which is the inside, and the stator. We have these little bits here on either side. Those are the fan blades. That's what cools the motor, and you'll find them on virtually every motor. And the other bit we have here is, you'll notice, and it's kind of hard to see if I put a little light on it back here, you can see that we've got 2 copper coils here and here. These are nothing special. They're just copper loops. They're not even tied together. What this is what's known as a shaded pole motor. So in a single phase motor, you have a magnetic field forming in the transformer, and that rotates as the voltage and current goes up and down. If things are in just the right position, when that turns on, the motor won't move. It'll just stay. If you have something like think of your air conditioner or outdoor fan, the fan kind of blowing the wrong direction in the presence of the wind, and you put the power to it, it will keep going that direction, even though it's the wrong direction. In order to make it go the right direction, you have to have something providing a magnetic force pulling the motor in the correct direction. And that is what these shaded poles here are for. So you have 2 of them. And I believe that this and this are connected, and that are connected. They'd almost have to be in order for this to work right, but not necessarily. And what that will do is this will charge a little bit slower than the rest of the transformer core here. And that will cause the magnetic field to drift in that particular direction and always turn the motor in that direction. And that also makes sure that it can't just get stuck. So because it's got the varying field here, it will turn toward it. So this motor will always turn in the clockwise direction. So it's just that simple. So I'm going to put this back in place here. Then I'm going to go up to the switch and show you how that operates. So give me just a bit to put this back in. Okay, so now that we've got the motor back in place and the belts and clutch back on, it's time to look at the upper portion of this. That is the more interesting bit. I don't know how this lighting is going to work, but I'm going to give it a try. Usually there is, at least in this particular unit, there's a cover plate that protects these so that they don't get interfered with, because there's no general cover plate on the bottom, so they protect the springs and the cams. So as I noted, this up here, if I can get it on camera, is the touch control wheel. Now this has, let's see if I can show this. I'm going to take the camera out of the camera mount for a moment. What this has, you can see it right there. There is a connection across that bar between that and the wheel shaft. Put this camera back in place. What that does is that makes this bar pivot back and forth. So as I turn the wheel, if you watch, you can see the bar change angle. What that does is it changes the tension on these springs. These springs are attached to the keys, so they will give it a softer or a harder feel depending on what you set. So as I set to 1, notice there's less spring tension, so the keys are going to go down easier. As these are key return springs, and it's important to remember. So when I set it up to 4, I'm pulling these springs to the maximum, so it will make the keys harder to press. And this can be good for people who are used to a very stiff standard manual typewriter, right? So now, what happens when you press a key is it drives down this cam here. Now what that does, and it's very, very hard to see. Let's see if I can get this. So that does, you can see this lever right here, and you can see this other bit right here. Now this, you can see, has a end that wraps around up to the right. That sits on top of this lever here, which, if you'll note, if you look over at one of these here, you see that it's not a flat end, that there's a bit of a, I don't know what you would call it, but a bit of a nose to it. So this sits just in front of that. So as I press it, it pushes that forward. What that does is it will raise this here, and again, this is a return spring. This is not anything that actually impacts the mechanism. So it will pivot that down, and that will pivot this cam down here. Now to understand what's going on there, let me put this typewriter back on its feet and show you that what we have is the rotor right here. Again, it's very hard to see, and I don't think it's in proper focus. Okay. And if you note, right down here, and put some more light on it, you can see that there are these little fingers. Now, when I press a key, you'll notice that these fingers, if I can find the right one, are getting pushed forward. And these keys, these little fingers, as I hold the key down and I turn the motor, well, voila. One of the type bars is coming up. Okay. That is how the whole system operates. That's all that happens. As I press a key and then I turn the motor, the type bar rises, strikes the platen, and then nothing happens. If I press it again, I get the same thing. So what's going on here is that the cams and I'll note that with gravity the way it is, there are certain things that aren't necessarily going to work quite right. For something with so many springs, it's amazing how much of these mechanical devices require gravity to be in the correct orientation. So as this bar turns, the fin catches that finger, pulls it up, pulls this cam, drives it against the type bar, and then, if I can show this here, what happens is that the lever up here will slip backward this direction away from the nose. And that will let this cam reset. Now, again, as I said, if with gravity being the way it is, things may not work quite right. If I hold the key down firmly, I can get it to trip again and again. That's not supposed to happen. At least not on these. Now, one problem you can have is that if this pivot here is slow, this one right here that's being moved as I move the motor, it can delay resetting and behave as though I've got the key down and I'm holding it. And that can cause one letter to effectively machine gun across the entire platen because it's just being tripped over and over again. So that's one area you want to make sure that you clean on this particular typewriter. Now, obviously, you have the keyless fulcrum, the type bar fulcrum, and the segment down here. So, you know, those things you also want to make sure that you clean properly, just like you would any other typewriter. And this is the important thing to note. The electrical bits are all up here and with the carriage advance. Everything else from this point down, minus the motor, is just your same mechanical typewriter. If you have a Smith Corona 5 Silent or a Silent Super or Sterling or Clipper, it's exactly the same mechanics here. Nothing else has changed. Just the cam system up here. That's it. So it's not as complicated as it might seem. There are a couple things I have to explain up top when I get there, but that's the main point. So let me go back to this because there are 3 special cams, actually technically 4, which you'll notice right here. So this one, technically that one, and then there's one over here off camera. This is for the period. Okay? That is a repeat key. What this arm does is it doesn't allow, when you press it down far enough, it doesn't allow the cam to reset. So here, as I wind this, I get a repeated dot. So you hold it down and there you go. Same thing with the space. If I hold it down, it's just going to keep moving. Now later editions have, the 6 series has a option of a single space and a power space so that you don't accidentally multiple space if you press too hard or you dwell too long on the keys, which is a problem sometimes. Now notice that the one that I held down just kind of accidentally, it sounds and it feels different than that, because this is a desired motion, this is an intended motion, this is gravity being in the wrong spot. Okay? And if you wanted to, technically, I suppose you could attach levers to every one of these and you would get the same sort of behavior, but you know, why bother? And that's pretty much all there is to electrical operation. The only thing else that I want to go over is the impression control and the power and safety switches. Now, as I noted, what this impression control is, I'm going to take the camera off of the stand so I can show this clearly. There is an eccentric on the back of this control, and it's that little black ring. So as I move this, let's see if I can set this flashlight here so you can see it. So as I move this, you'll see that and the little finger that acts as a stop. So as I move the eccentric, what happens is this bar goes up or down. Okay. And what that does is it raises, you see it goes through the case here, and it falls under, it ends under the bottom of this lever. This spring here is just to provide back tension, so that as I unwind, that the lever will go back where it belongs. The same thing with this little spring here. So as I move this, you can see that there is some motion in the motor. There's not going to be a lot because there's no tension because the motor isn't actually on, but it will move that back and forth. Now on the power switch here, this is also a little bit different. This is not actually a switch. This is a block. And if you look, you can see that block turning left and right. And what it does is it allows this lever to rise and fall. That is governed by the safety back here. So you can see that there's a, so you can kind of see that back here. I know it's not really in necessarily good focus. But this lever here also acts as a block. So between the two of them, power can't come on unless the switch is turned on, the rotary switch, and the safety is engaged. Now as I lift the safety up, or push the safety down, you can see this lever lift up. Now as I said, this is a block and this is a safety. This is not the switch. This is the switch. And if you look under here, you can see that there's a little return lever and a little bit of a button. So as the safety is depressed, it raises up and presses that button. Now, that's kind of obvious. When you follow the power cord, you'll notice that it goes into this area here. So I'm going to put this back on the camera stand, and I'm going to take this switch off and show you what it looks like. There's nothing really complicated about it. It's just your basic single pole electrical switch. It's got kind of a long screw, and there are only two of them. Come on. So this on top here, this is just to protect the connections, to insulate the connections and hold it in place. So nothing special about that. Here is your switch. If I bring this forward, you can see that I have the two electrical connections, one here and one here. And I've got the little white button switch. This rests on top of that, and that is your power switch. Now, one thing to note about these switches is that over time they can go rotten, the plastic, and they can start to fall apart. So that's another thing that you need to pay attention to when you get one of these units, is just open the cover and see what condition the plastic is in here. If it looks like it's in good shape, then you're fine. So I'm going to do something now which I don't advise anyone to do. I'm going to plug this unit in, and I'm going to hold a multimeter up onto these switch connections, and then I'm going to trip the safety. So I can show you that across this connection, well, actually I don't have to trip the safety. There's 120 volts. This is switching line voltage. All right? That's something to be aware of. So you're getting line voltage through this black cable onto the side and up to the switch. So, and that is independent of this, because the line voltage is coming into one, then you move the block and the safety, it depresses the switch, and then the line voltage goes out the other connection back into the transformer, back into the motor. So please make sure that you understand that anywhere that there's a power cord in this unit, you are dealing with 120 volts power and whatever the circuit is capable of providing. So please do not treat that lightly. All right, let me get rid of this and put everything back where it belongs and make everything nice and safe, because we like things when they're nice and safe. So unplugging the unit, turning the block back off, the switch, put this back over here, goes that way. Connections back in here. Come on. Magnetic screwdrivers are not always the best. There's one. Let's put the other in here. And now, if I plug it back in, turn it on and hit the safety, everything works. And that's all there is to it. One thing you need to do on these typewriters is you have to test the type bars to see how they line up in the type guide. And on any of the other units, you press the key and you lift the type bar. You can't do that here. Because there's this electromechanical drive, electromechanical drive in between the key and the key lever and the type bar, you need to move the motor with your finger to cause the type bar to rest so that you can pull it back up. Now, the other way to do this is to reach under and to trip the cam down here, to take the second bar and the second one and pull it forward. And that too will lift the given type bar. But of course, you don't know which one you're grabbing. You just kind of have to work your way across, so that can get kind of confusing. If you want to do it by particular letter, then you have to press and use the motor in order to allow you to raise the bar. Now, I can trip this several times, but if I let it go back too far, then I'm not going to be able to raise it all the way necessarily. So that's, again, one of the little drawbacks is that you have to provide the mechanical power, the electrical power yourself in order to do the job. Now, while you do that, it's also useful that you unplug the typewriter, which I did not do. And you'll notice I didn't even turn it off. So just be safe. Smith Corona 5TE Electro-Mechanical Deep Dive. My name is Wayne, and this has been another episode of Type Tested.